Hi, U.S. history folks. I'm up here in the corner. The first thing I want to say is I am fine. I'm not sick, but my doctors have said because of my autoimmune disease, I cannot be at work right now. So, as long as COVID is going around, I'm not allowed to leave my house. However, that doesn't mean we're going to stop learning. You're just going to get more pictures of me and selfies with my cat. In the meantime, until I can come back, here's what our classes are going to look like. We're going to have a short video lecture. It should stay under 10 minutes every time. Some kind of activity or reading or discussion, and then you're going to submit an assignment on PowerSchool. At any time during these video lectures, feel free to pause the video to take notes if you need to. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you a couple seconds to open Word, get paper out, so that we can take notes on the very worst part of the Great Depression. So take a second, get those out. And before we get to the low point, let's talk about 1929 to 1934 again. Quick review. First of all, see if you can remember what is it that contributed to the economic collapse. There were a bunch of factors. What do you remember? Here's a few of them. Stock market speculation, people betting that it was going to work forever. Buying on credit, so using money you don't actually have. Agricultural overproduction. We had all these new farming inventions that let us make more food, but having more food meant the price went down. Government policy errors, especially what we did with tariffs going back and forth on European goods. Uneven distribution of wealth, which meant the poor had no extra money to spend. All these 5 things add up and create a panic that leads to banks closing, which leads to businesses closing, which leads to further unemployment, and it keeps going around in a cycle until the entire economy has collapsed. So that's how we get where we get. Second question, what were some of the bad things that happened to people? There were a lot. What can you remember? Here's some of them. Like we mentioned, unemployment. After that comes loss of saving, loss of your homes, people going hungry, or you have to rely on charity to get food, things like bread lines, soup kitchens. There's a famous recipe for dandelion soup out there. So getting food wherever you could, which was not helped by the Dust Bowl. We went from having agricultural overproduction to every farm in the Midwest being absolutely destroyed by these huge dust bowls. They were storms that could bury a farm in a couple hours, and these went on for upwards of 4 years, totally destroying our entire bread basket in the Midwest. On top of all these things, we end up with a big homelessness problem that leads to something called Hoovervilles. Outside of cities, they were basically huge homeless encampments, shacks built of whatever people could find while they were trying to survive. So that's our review of the basics of what was going on with people and the economy. Today we're going to talk about what was going on with the government. What was the government trying to do to address this? At the time, our president was a fellow named Herbert Hoover. And at first he tried to address the problem by not addressing it. He was a big advocate of the government not interfering with people's problems. And the 2 things he really liked at the start of the Great Depression were 2 policies called volunteerism and localism. And they're both basically what they sound like. With volunteerism, you ask private citizens to volunteer to help each other. asking that people with enough money to give to charity do so, etc. And with localism, he believed that local governments knew more about how to help their communities than necessarily the federal government would. And that makes sense, but we're going to see in a minute why it still didn't work. The last thing is he asked the government to reduce taxes and interest rates with the hope that that was going to help the average citizen make ends meet. So at the start of the Depression, this is what he attempted. However, this did not work out for a variety of reasons. First of all, volunteerism, no one did it. Charities lost too much money and couldn't help people. Local governments never have as much tax revenue as states and the federal government, so they didn't have enough money to help people as much as was needed. On top of that, unemployment kept increasing, and that led to more panic setting in, so eventually the situation got out of control. After a few years of not intervening, wasn't working, Hoover did attempt some activism. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. We'll start with the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Was a government organization based on the trickle-down theory of economics. And in the trickle-down theory, the idea is that if you loan money to the wealthy, then that money will eventually trickle down to everybody else, because the people who own big business, railroads, banks, will have the money to hire people, to reduce unemployment, to give out loans so that people can start businesses and buy houses. So the RFC was in charge of loaning government funds to big businesses and railroad companies. However, you have to remember that everyone was panicking. So because of that, banks did not increase the amount of loans that they were giving out, and businesses didn't hire more workers. They just hung on to this money because they were scared of losing it. What that meant is that none of that money trickled down, it all stayed at the top. Hoover's activism did lead to one good thing, which was the Hoover Dam. That's where it got its name. This is pretty close to Las Vegas in the Southwest. And in constructing the Hoover Dam, he made a lot of jobs in the Southwest that helped kickstart the economy a little bit. And it also led to that area having electrical power, which means that more businesses could open that required electrical power. So the Hoover Dam was a success in Hoover's attempt at government intervention. However, between the failure of volunteerism, the failure of trickle-down economics, and what we're about to see, that was too much for Hoover to continue with his political career. What we're about to see is how he handled a group called the Bonus Army. I'm gonna move my face out of there. And the Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans. And they had been promised a bonus for fighting in the army that would be guaranteed paid to them by 1945. However, all these veterans were in horrible poverty, and they wanted that money immediately in the early 1930s. They said, "We fought for this country, we were injured, many of us died for this country, and right now we're starving to death, we want our money." They march on Washington and become known as the Bonus Army because they're veterans that want their bonuses. And the way Hoover reacts to this group of veterans it ends up not being good. He tells a man named General Douglas MacArthur to get these veterans off the streets by any means necessary. And Douglas MacArthur goes a bit overboard on that. He fires tear gas into the crowds. He orders his soldiers to fix bayonets on their guns in case they needed to fire into the crowds and fight. Overall, the public looked on this reaction toward their veterans, and they were so disgusted and horrified that it was pretty much guaranteed Hoover was going to lose the next election. So overall, Herbert Hoover's policy of we're going to hope the public takes care of the problem itself, and then his too little too late attempts at intervening with the problem, and then his essentially firing upon veterans with tear gas, ends up that in 1934 something has to give. And next week we get to talk about what that is, which is the election of FDR. In the meantime, for the rest of today, here's what I want you to do. In your textbooks, on page 728, there are a bunch of questions. I only want you to answer 6 to 15. And the way we're going to do assignments right now is you're going to type up your answers and submit them on a PowerSchool Dropbox. If you don't know how to find that, in the top toolbar on my PowerSchool is a link that says Activities. You click Activities and then Assignments, and it should be the first thing in the assignments, something like Great Depression's questions. So, type up your answers to those. If you're not sure what any of the answers are, the chapter comes right before the page with the questions. Shocking, I know. So, flip through that, and I will be grading and commenting as you submit things every day. Hopefully I get to see you all really soon, but in the meantime, watch out for each other, wash your hands, follow the Redmond way, and stay awesome. And I will see you as soon as possible. Thanks, y'all.